Our wonderful Max Weber Chair for German and European Politics here at NYU, Christiane Lemke, who has organized this conference, has asked me to say just a few words about our location of the conference of Deutsches Haus. We are now in existence for 36 years. We are one of several international houses of NYU who were founded in 1977. And Deutsches Haus, historically in the 70s and 80s, was also a platform for intellectuals and academics and artists from both Eastern and Western Germany who could meet in a neutral, so to speak, forum which was not run by the German government. We have a cultural program, an academic program, as well as a language program. We are the only big language school here in New York and teach German to all New Yorkers, as well as a kids program, and we call ourselves a window for New Yorkers to the German-speaking world. This is the third annual conference Christiane Lemke has organized here at Deutsches Haus. So the first two conferences in 2011 and 2012 were dedicated to the European Union. This year's conference is the first one focusing on Germany. Particularly since we are, of course, in an election year. The big question is whether these elections in the fall will change anything domestically in Germany, but also whether they will change anything about Germany's relationship with Europe. Every national election in Europe, as the recent results in Italy, for example, have shown, has the potential to strongly impact the course of Europe as a whole. This is particularly true of Germany, the so-called powerhouse of Europe. While the crisis of the Eurozone has clearly left a mark on Germany, more and more Germans seem to get tired of Europe. They also realize, however, that their countries and Europe's future are dependent on each other. So I think it is very timely that we chose this point in time, almost half a year before a new Bundestag will be elected, to have a close look at Germany, domestically, within the European context as well as internationally. I'm very happy that tonight's keynote speech by Professor Daniel Hamilton from SAIS will look at this wider context and give us an update of the current transatlantic relationship. I would like to thank all those who have contributed to this conference, first and foremost Professor Christiane Lemke, but also Erika Lee, as well as NYU Center for European and Mediterranean Studies, and last but not least the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD, for providing us with the means to organize it. I want to also thank all the participants of this conference for coming. I want to welcome you all again. I'm looking very much forward to tonight's lecture and to tomorrow's panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin, for these very kind words of welcoming and introduction. I would like to welcome you all here on behalf of the Center for European Studies at NYU, our graduate students in Master in European Studies, our doctoral students, guests from NYU and beyond, and of course our distinguished speakers whom we will introduce tomorrow. Tonight, the floor will be for our keynote speaker, Daniel Hamilton. And Professor Hamilton and I met, well, I may say so, we're not the youngest anymore, during the Cold War. I mean, in the 1980s, when he was the deputy director of Aspen Institute in Berlin. And I think it was 1988 when Dr. Hamilton and Shepard Stone, who was the director at that time, organized a conference on East Germany and invited actually people from East Germany, speakers, to attend this conference. And it was a very interesting time because, as you all know, by the late 1980s, the communist bloc was already crumbling, and there were a lot of events in Poland and other countries that were a source of concern and questions what will happen in East Germany. And of course, nobody predicted the fall of the wall, including us scholars. It is a very, very great pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Hamilton here at NYU. I'm very happy that you came. And I would like to introduce his vita, even though it's so rich and so dense and really an accomplished career. But let me just highlight a few points here. He's the Austrian Marshall Fund professor at the Johns Hopkins University and director of the Center for Transatlantic Relations at SAIS. He's also the executive director of the American Consortium for EU Studies in the United States. He has held several senior positions in the US Department of State with the Clinton administration, including Deputy Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, US Special Coordinator for Southeast European Stabilization, Associate Director of the Secretary's Policy Planning Staff. And in 2008, he served as the first Robert Bosch Foundation Senior Diplomatic Fellow in the German Foreign Office. In 2012, and that is very interesting to all of us attending this conference, he was a member of German Chancellor Angela Merkel's Futures Advisory Group. We'd really like to hear what you advised Dr. Merkel. Professor Hamilton has also taught in various high-end universities, including the Free University of Berlin, Innsbruck University, the Hertie School of Governance. He's a frequent traveler to Germany and to other European countries. And if this was not enough, he also published a number of very, very interesting studies, including the Transatlantic Economy, Europe's Economic Crisis, Transatlantic 2020, A Tale of Four Futures, just to name a few. And he speaks German fluently, so he is certainly one of the best-known experts on German politics here in the United States. I would like to welcome you here at Deutsche Haus then, and please, the floor is yours.
It's a real pleasure to be here. I said if you're at the Deutsches Haus, you have to speak a little German just to get in the mood. So it's fun to do that. It's a really pleasure. As Christiane said, I won't say we're old friends, but we're friends of good standing. And thinking at that time what to do with the GDR and the division of Europe and Germany and Berlin, that was daily life. And now it's a different world. So I was asked as the setting for the conference you're doing tomorrow on Germany in particular to sort of set a frame a bit in terms of the transatlantic relationship. So that's what I'll do. I'm happy to talk about Germany more if you'd like, or other issues, but let me start with that frame, and I'll make references perhaps to some German elements to try to relate to the topic you're going to discuss. You know, I travel a lot across the Atlantic, and I'm also in Washington. And when you're in Washington, maybe here in New York too, and the word Europe comes up, people sort of shake their heads, say, wow, what a mess. What is going on? You know, the headlines are just full of Europe one day after another. The next crisis comes up. It just doesn't seem they can, you know, get their act together. And it's really something. And it infects how people think about policy. But I just came back from a 2-week tour of Europe. The State Department asked me to go talk there. And I got to tell you, when I go to every capital in Europe and the word the United States comes up, people shake their heads. They say, wow, what a mess. They can't get anything together. They're polarized in their politics. They can't pass a budget. They're at each other's throats. They're shooting each other. I mean, what's going on? And unfortunately, you know, there's a bit of reality in both of those. But we're having a conversation sort of about each other, and it's the same one. And I think maybe we don't realize that, but it's really that kind of discussion. It's not a good one. And meanwhile, you know, the rest of the world's marching ahead. And so I think there is a bit of truth in sort of this head shaking on both sides of the Atlantic, because we're each facing really quite serious problems. And I think that has to be the context for talking about a relationship, because on each side of the Atlantic, we're facing some tough issues. I would argue we're each paying a very high economic price for our inability to resolve kind of central, tough political issues. And so in my view, much of what we're facing in this country, what we're facing in Europe, are really at their core political problems. But the economic consequences of them are really proving to be quite severe. You know, if I had to say in the United States, what's that core issue? It's about the role of government in society. You know, what's the appropriate role of the government in our economy and society? We're having big fights about that, and one of our political parties is having its own civil war on that issue. And it's just stopping things from happening so much. I live this every day in Washington, so people say, how's life in Washington? I say, well, life's pretty good, but the politics is really awful. And come see it to believe it. But in Europe, I think the Euro crisis is sort of a manifestation of the fact that the Euro zone itself, the Euro itself, was essentially a political project, if we recall its real origins. It was really a bargain between Germany becoming united and its neighbors about how to reassure each other about how this was all going to work out, and by binding the German economy into their partners really tightly, that would give reassurance to the neighbors, and by providing Germany with sort of a zone of stability for which German industry could really do lots of stuff, that seemed to work out pretty well. But they didn't put together a fiscal union. They didn't agree on a crisis mechanism at the time, and the first countries to break the rules were Germany and France, which led others to say, hey, that sounds like we all could do that. So I think because of that, Europeans are facing also a core political issue, which is, are they really prepared to go to that next step of integration, which all that means for sovereignty, or are they prepared to sort of stay in this sort of loose confederal kind of world, with all that means for Europe's competitiveness in the world? They're not easy choices. I believe Europe has started to make the choice for deeper integration. But we see all the landmines and hurdles that have to be dealt with before you go that way. And I think the Chancellor really is sort of in the middle of this. I do believe she has a sense of how do you get from here to there, but she has an election. And she has to maneuver lots of things that I think seen from the outside sometimes people aren't aware of in terms of all the hurdles of German domestic politics. But let me just leave that for a moment just to say that's sort of the setting I see for how we think about how we work together around the world. As the President said, we got a little nation building to do at home. And I think we're not going to be reliable partners for each other and act together abroad unless we each get our acts together at home. And that's sort of a premise for policy which really starts to inform a lot of other things. And we're just in one of those moments where if we don't have a solid foundation, if we can't show our model works for our own people, it's very hard to say it works for, you know, billions of others in the world. We're sort of at that one of those moments where you have to sort of really say, look, we have to get some priorities here. And so we're each turned inward, and sometimes we're not then paying attention to the other as much as we can. We take the relationship for granted very often with each other. It's a strong relationship. We know each other. We're allies. You know, what's the problem? Sort of attitude, which means we neglect then lots of things that can be problematic. But I think that sort of complacency and sort of taking each other for granted is sort of a major challenge. But it's one that's, you know, I do believe is understandable given the problems we have right now. But I don't think that's enough. I mean, the world doesn't wait for the US or Europe to get its act together. It's marching ahead. And so we really do have to think about how we position ourselves for the world that we're facing, and not the world of the Berlin Wall. And I think too often that we fall into the legacy relationship sort of sense. You know, if only we could recapture that earlier sense of solidarity and so on. Well, that world is not here anymore. And rather than base a relationship on sort of pathos and, you know, memories, we should, you know, we should think forward. We have to remember why we had such a relationship. It wasn't for the best of reasons. The fact that Europe destroyed itself multiple times in the 20th century was the reason why the United States was engaged in Europe so deeply. It's not the best of reason. And thank God we're talking about something else these days than what to do across that wall. So I think I would put forward that the United States is thinking very hard about this actually, and is trying to rebalance and reposition the transatlantic relationship for the world we're going to face, not the world we left behind. And it's seeking a rebalance with Europe in three ways that I think is going to prove challenging for our European colleagues. And I think there's a German aspect to each one of those, but let me come to those. So there's the first rebalance I think the U.S. is really pressing on is in the security relationship. We have a security alliance, NATO, busier than ever. It's just active everywhere. It's doing all sorts of missions simultaneously. It doesn't have the clear, focus that it did during the Cold War, but it is very active. And I think leaders haven't quite conveyed to publics or to parliaments NATO's, sort of activity and missions, but it is there, and it's healthy as an alliance. There's really not a question about it. But within that alliance, I think there are things that are legacy relationships that don't make sense anymore. It really is hard to understand for Americans why the United States would pay 75% of the NATO defense costs, one country, and all the others added together 25%. I mean, that doesn't pass any sustainable test of political viability. Now, those numbers are going to come down because some of them were inflated because of the wars we were in. But the relationships, and we're cutting a lot in the Pentagon, but Europeans are cutting almost faster. So the relationship's still going to be out of sync. At a time when this alliance is not so much just focused on stabilizing Europe, it's about dealing with a whole range of other kinds of issues. So I think the United States is saying to the Europeans, we are your ally, we will be there. There's no doubt about it. Still maintaining troops in Europe and Germany, rotating troops into Central Europe and doing exercises, lots of things with European allies. We will provide assets that only the United States has, that Europe does not have, like flying French troops to Mali because they can't fly there themselves. Or cruise missiles in Libya. Or the political solidarity with Kosovo that Europe cannot provide to the Kosovars. These are things the United States provides with our European allies that they do not provide themselves. And the United States is okay with that. But it doesn't have to run the show every minute on every issue. I think what you've seen is a real change, that the United States has said, we're comfortable with the Europeans leading on security issues close to their continent. Why not? Why do we have to run everything? And you see that. In the Balkans, I was very engaged in the Balkans. No one in the Clinton administration left not having to do with the Balkans, unfortunately. We're on track in the Balkans. It's still very hard. It's not fixed. It could blow up tomorrow. But we're on track there. And the way we're on track is this part of Europe thinks if it creates the right conditions, it can be part of the EU and be part of all our institutions. And that's a radical idea. It was very radical a little over 10 years ago that was in fact part of Europe. Many people in Western Europe would argue, are the Balkans part of Europe? Well, I think hopefully we're moved beyond that. But the only real strategy for the Balkans has to be one of integration, just as it was for other parts of Europe. And the United States is very content because it realizes the EU is the magnet for that, to work with the Europeans, provide again some aspects, but let them, guide it. And that's what's happening. In Libya, you saw another model in which Europeans led in the coalition. The United States provided assets and was there, but it didn't have to run things. In Mali, you see another model where it's the French are leading. It's not a NATO operation, but the United States is also there and helping, doing what it can. This is, I think, what the United States is saying to our European allies. And this is difficult because I think you see in Europe, given the economic crisis, just a budget-cutting, fiesta going on in terms of slashing all sorts of military is an easy target for the budget acts when you look around you and say, hey, what's the problem? And I think particularly in Germany, it intersects with continuing German debates about why you have a military and German security. What is Germany's security obligation as an ally? During the Cold War, I always talk about the Bonn Republic, that was West Germany at that time. NATO was there to protect Germany. That was the point of NATO in German eyes. The idea that Germans would go protect others, that was a wild idea. And as soon as the Cold War ended, that wall came down, Germany started to be called upon to go protect others. And they have done that. But it's tough. It's very tough. And then you have the United States coming and say, not only that, but we want you to really step up. So we have an issue here in terms of the rebalance of our security alliance, in which the United States is really asking the Europeans to step up just at the moment when they're kind of stepping down. And I think you'll see that play out over the next few years. And I think Germany is particularly caught in that dilemma because of its debate. The German abstention on Libya sent a lot of shockwaves around the world, not just in Europe and not just here. It really was a signal to other Europeans. Really, can they really trust their ally on some things? And there are a number of examples like that where NATO allies wonder a bit about German solidarity as an ally. That's not a good position to be in. And so that's going to be a tough debate. The second rebalance is between the security relationship, security part of our relationship, and the economic. Again, the legacy Cold War relationship meant we measured the health of our alliance, our partnership, by troop levels and defense budgets. That was the standard. Are we having a good relationship? Well, yeah, we're all investing 2% in, military and things like that. That's understandable. It's still important. I just talked about it. But it certainly can't be the entire relationship. Why do we continue to define the transatlantic relationship mainly through NATO when we have such a richer and deeper and wider relationship than that? And why shouldn't we look at how we should tap the full potential of our relationship beyond the military itself, especially at a time when our economies are hurting and we're facing rising markets around the world? So that's the background behind the recent announcement by the President and on all EU leaders that they want to start negotiations on a transatlantic trade and investment partnership. That's the name. The jargon is TTIP. It's not what I asked for, but it's what we're getting, so I'm going to live with that. And I think this is very important. This will be, I would argue, this is going to be not only the economic, but the political and strategic driver of this relationship over the next years. This is going to be it. And it's not just a trade agreement. It's not your daddy's old trade agreements. It's something different. In fact, it's going to be groundbreaking if they get it right. Because one has to understand a couple things about our relationship and why you would do this. And so just to step back, the transatlantic economy is by far the largest in the world. It's about $5.3 trillion. About 15 million people on both sides of the Atlantic owe their jobs to this relationship. And it is close to half of world GDP, about 41% of its purchasing power for the economists out there who look at these measures. Anyway, it's big. It's very big. So if you put together both of those economies and you start to think about a transatlantic market from Hawaii to the Black Sea, 800 million people, this is serious stuff. And it's the richest markets in the world. Now, this is not a new idea. This is an old idea. It's at least 20 years old. But every effort to kind of get it to this stage has been stymied by lots of technical regulatory issues, lots of differences how our societies work. And so what's different this time is that the President of the United States, the first time any president has said, let's actually go try that and do this. And you get all 27 heads of government in the EU saying, we agree, let's go do this. So in case people aren't picking up on this, the EU has to finish its mandate, and the US has a comment period right now on this, public comment. The President's probably going to Europe in June. And at that time, they'll probably start the negotiations on this. Now, what are we talking about here? We're talking about, as I said, something that's not just a trade agreement. But let's talk about trade for a minute. So trade across the Atlantic, $650 billion, a lot of money. Trade's pretty free across the Atlantic. It's only about 3 to 4% trade barriers, tariff barriers across the Atlantic. There's some spikes in some products, but you know, it's already pretty free. So a lot of people say, well, why worry about this? Because it's already okay. We have big barriers elsewhere around the world. Well, if you just reduce 3 to 4% barriers on $800 million, $5.3 trillion market, 800 million people, $5.3 trillion market, that's pretty good. 3 to 4%, you know, reduction would have big, big payoffs. If Europe would just grow 2% every year, which is hard at the moment, it would, you know, create a country, a market the size of the country of Argentina every year. It's not 10% growth in Argentina, it is Argentina, because Europe is such a big, big market. It's the biggest market in the world. So even small changes in really big markets are going to have a bigger impact than big changes in tiny markets. It doesn't matter how fast they're growing. And one has to always watch the media when you talk about fast growth, because you just got to say from where. And so just keep things in mind. So even though Europe might grow slowly, or we might grow slowly, just some small growth in our markets could be more meaningful to people and markets around the world than big growth elsewhere. So if we can do that, that would be significant. And they have said everything's on the table, including agriculture. That's going to be interesting. That's held that back before. We could talk about these details if you like, but I'm saying the trade piece, it could really have an impact. The estimate, basic estimate that some analysts have done is that a US-EU, just the trade piece, would be about 5 times the value of the US-Korea trade deal. Okay, and everybody was talking about that as a big deal. This would be 5 times that, and trade's not the most important part of it. The second piece that's more important is services. Most jobs in the United States and in Europe are in the services economy. That's where people work these days. So if you're going to do something to boost jobs, you're going to open up the services economy, and that's really protected. It's both protected on both sides of the Atlantic. So if we could use this to open up the services economy across the Atlantic, it'd be the single most important international initiative to create jobs in the world. Because there aren't any other services economies really in the world. There's Australia and Canada and so on, but it's really the US and Europe. And we're each other's biggest markets and most profitable markets, and if we can open them up even further, it would have big ripple effects on our economy. And these are not, in Europe, especially in Germany, for instance, when you talk about services, the notion of the Polish plumber or, Turkish Gastarbeiter or somebody appears. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about legal services, accounting, construction services, financial services, the whole creative class, everything that keeps us a knowledge economy, which is our real edge, is the services economy, and the same in Germany, and the same in the rest of Europe. So services, really, really big, really important, and really only could be done transatlantically, because there aren't any others, really. None of that's the real driver of our economy. The real driver of the transatlantic economy is investment. And this is, again, where the media sometimes, they get it half right, and then that means they get it all wrong. Because we use, usually, and politicians too, they use trade as the benchmark for commerce. And they say, there's so much trade going on with China, and that's changing the world, and all of that. China will change the world. But trade is not commerce. Trade is a piece of commerce. It's usually trade in goods. That's really a piece of commerce. Then you got to add services, and then you got to add investment. And you keep one thing in mind, our relationship across the Atlantic is driven by investment flows, not trade flows. And our relationship, each of ours, with Asia is driven by trade flows, not investment flows. It's a very simple distinction, makes all the difference. Because that's how companies really work. They don't want to send stuff across the ocean. They'd rather go across the ocean and set up there and sell their goods or services in the other market. American companies do that better than anybody. They've been doing it for a long, long time. But the last 20 years or so, European companies and German companies have been coming here massively because they're setting up in the strategic market of NAFTA. And so what's happening is that 2/3 of German exports, Germany thinks of itself as a trading company, but investments of Germany are about 4 times greater than German exports to the United States, their investments here. And 2/3 of those exports are driven by the companies themselves. When Siemens builds a factory, when, say, BMW builds a factory in Spartanburg, South Carolina, then BMW of Munich starts exporting parts and components to Spartanburg, South Carolina. 2/3 of Germany's trade is that. It's BMW trading with itself. And so you want to do everything you can to have this investment come in, because it's also different in trade because you're investing in a community. You're creating jobs. You're doing real stuff. That part of the Carolinas, Spartanburg, Charlotte, is the biggest center of German investment in the United States. And it's not the BMWs of the world, it's the Mittelstand, no-name companies that are there en masse and have really transformed that part of the United States. And the jobs there are really quite dependent on continued open access to investment. So investment is really important. Now what's happened is in the EU, the Treaty of Lisbon, their most recent treaty, has made investment the competence, the authority of the EU Central, of the Commission and Brussels. Member states don't have any authority anymore over investment. The United States has all these bilateral agreements and investment and has nothing with Brussels. And so even for legal certainty for companies, you got to have some framework to enshrine sort of core principles, open principles of investment with the EU. So part of this agreement has to deal with the investment piece, if only to make sure it continues, because it's the real driver. And there's no other trend going on in the world. American companies, last year, a bad year for Europe, invested about $200 billion in Europe. They disinvested from China. They took money out of China. They're not investing in China. There is no net rush to China when you look at investment. And the trade rush to China is the rush coming the other way. It's us importing goods. So one has to really break down our relationship to see who our main partners really are and why a transatlantic agreement would have all these other kind of ripple effects that no other one really would. And the last piece on this, which is the toughest piece, is on regulatory issues. It's the stuff you hear about in the newspapers, right? It's bananas and beef and Boeing, Airbus, and how you clean a chicken. And how you clean a chicken, somehow both the US and EU allow themselves to determine was the key issue of the last 8 years of their trade relationship. And if they couldn't decide how to clean a chicken, nothing else would go forward. This is why we haven't done this for so long. Because somebody said, well, this is a tough issue. If you can't solve that, how can we solve every other issue? Let's make that the litmus test of our relationship. I mean, that's ridiculous. But that's what we've been doing. So my proposal, we create the chicken subcommittee. You put it over here. You keep them going. You have to, it's an important industry, but it shouldn't block everything. And so let's talk about how we align our regulations, because so the story of the transatlantic economy is deep integration. We're not drifting apart. We are more deeply integrated than ever before and have a greater stake in each other's success than ever before because of the jobs. So if we can figure out a way these different regulations across the Atlantic can somehow be aligned, that's going to have actually more impact in the trade piece. And it starts to get technical, and then people start to glaze off, especially politicians. Oh my God, what are we talking about here? Chicken and all that stuff. But it's really actually at the core of globalization, because you're having two continents so deeply integrated, and if you can't figure out a way with the continent most like yours, most like your system, of how to deal with this deep integration, how are we possibly going to do it with systems that are very different? So it's really the cutting edge of globalization. It's going to be more in these areas than the trade agenda that's going to make a difference. So this is a big deal. As I say, if you can reposition the transatlantic economy for the kind of world we're facing, this is going to really have a new way of thinking about our partnership. The next rebalance is not a new one, but it's one that I'd say over the last 20 years, American administrations have tried with varying success on our European colleagues, and that is to say, the legacy of the Cold War relationship was that when we said transatlantic relations, we meant Europe. Stabilizing Europe was transatlantic relations. It was all about the Europeans, right? Because that was the problem. And, that was 90% of the agenda. Well, today it's not 90% of the agenda. There's maybe, 25, 30% of the agenda still in Europe, and it's mainly how you stabilize the wider Europe, the space to the east of the EU, which is still a pretty turbulent area. But it's not 90% of the agenda. That other agenda is how we work together beyond Europe and whether we work together beyond Europe. The United States is a global power. It is also a Pacific country, has been for a while now. So this notion about the pivot is always rather odd, I think, to most Americans because, we've been there for a while. And it's not a pivot away from Europe. It's hopefully a pivot with Europe to Asia. That's the message. And the question is whether Europeans are ready to make that pivot with us. Are they really ready to be that type of partner in which we're engaged not 90% in Europe, but 90% out of Europe? That would be a relationship many Americans would feel pretty comfortable with. It's not a relationship many Europeans would feel too comfortable with yet. And so the US is pushing. There's always, especially with Germany, always sort of an expectation gap. We always have higher expectations. We're always pushing. And you see that right now. Jack Lew just went across the ocean and told the Germans again, better, prime that economy. We're always doing that. That's just the nature of the relationship. They're not going to do that, but that's the way we interact. So, it's the relationship today, when you say transatlantic relations, you don't mean Europe anymore as the only thing you want to talk about. It's about the Arab Spring and what are we going to do together about that. It's about Syria. Are we going to do anything about that? It's about Mali, ungoverned spaces in Africa. It's about climate change. It's about energy. It's about the rise of China. And what is still distinctive about this relationship, despite all the changes, is that if we do agree across the Atlantic on these kinds of issues, usually we're the core of any global coalition that gets anything done. And if we disagree across the Atlantic, there's usually not a coalition that gets anything done. And we can't say that about any other relationship we have. So this relationship is still pretty indispensable, but the kind of world we're facing, it's insufficient now in and of itself to set the rules, set the tone. You have to build with other partners. And that's this other agenda, the agenda beyond Europe, which is really challenging for a continent at the moment on the European side that's so inward-looking and driven by its own preoccupations. And the Americans are saying, hey, look at all these other issues here. Now, it works both ways. We have problems with climate change. The Europeans are saying, hey, what about that issue? So we haven't found the right balance there. But my point is that if you take rebalanced security relationship, rebalance between security and economics, and rebalance between our agenda in Europe and an agenda beyond Europe, you're talking about a pretty different transatlantic partnership than the one we used to know. And there are going to be some challenges with that. Basically, I believe that's where we're going to be going. But we got to get over the economic challenges we're facing because they are not only distracting us, but they are really limiting our ability to be partners for each other in the way that we both need us to be. Now, my last point would be so 3 rebalances and there's one disconnect. And it's the energy disconnect. What we're seeing across the Atlantic is 2 energy revolutions going on at the same time, and they're going like this. And that is going to be interesting, but I don't think we've thought through what it all means. In the United States, all we're talking about these days is our shale gas revolution and cheap energy and all that, and it is amazing. And we'll have blowbacks, and we'll kind of have debates and environmental issues and all of that. But fundamentally, we're moving in a very different direction than we had thought just recently. And that phenomenon is not limited to the United States. We tend to focus on ourselves. Canada is certainly part of that. But what you're seeing is after the obviously the disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, they're about to turn on all the switches again. And you're going to see that, again, become the center of exploration, energy exploration in the world. Mexico, with a new president, is about to invite foreign investors to really take over the Mexican energy industry. And if you go all along the eastern coast of South America, the energy they're discovering there is really stunning. And if you go to the west coast of Africa, you're seeing the same. So what you're actually seeing is that the Atlantic basin as a whole is going to become, in my view, the energy reservoir for the world. We already get more energy from the Atlantic than the Middle East. We're talking about independence here, but it's going to be Atlantic-related dependencies if we have them. We're not going to be as dependent on the Middle East. That's going to raise some strategic questions for the Europeans if the Americans don't feel they're quite as strategically bound as they do. I think we're bound to Israel, but the framework is changing significantly. So you have cheap energy, you have new kinds of sources happening all over the place, but not in Europe. And in Europe, because of dependency, especially the German concern about being dependent on others, especially state-owned resources perhaps, but Central Eastern Europe particularly worried. What the Germans, the Energiewende, it's being put forward by the Chancellor, it's often portrayed here as sort of a knee-jerk German reaction to Fukushima. It's basically get out of nuclear power, and that's about it. It's a big green thing. I think that misappreciates what really is going on here. It is a huge gamble, and it might not work, and you see sort of cracks already in the consensus in Germany about some of this. But why would German industry agree to all this? Because the underlying message that's happening in German society is that, given that world the Germans are facing, they have to maybe break through to a new industrial model. They have to actually create something just new if they're going to maintain their position in the world. And it's not good enough to keep using energy the way we use it now in a planet of 9 billion people. The math just doesn't work on that one, despite what we're finding here. So the generational challenge, I would argue, the real number one, top challenge, this is it, is how you break the link between the production of wealth and the consumption of resources. How do we do that? You got a planet of 9 billion people, they're all entered the labor market. And they all want electricity and clean water, and they want everything that you and I want. And if they can get that, that's going to benefit us. Except at some point, we explode the system. So if you could actually break through to a new industrial model based on super energy efficiency and different kinds of sources of energy and how your society uses that, you would be a first mover. You would be in a very different position than anybody else. And actually, even though they don't say it this way, I think Germans tend to focus more on the pessimistic part of these things, you would break through to a new world. I mean, this is the gamble that they're really putting at stake here. The Chancellor, for being someone everyone thinks is so cautious, is really, gambling Germany's future on this type of breakthrough. So this is quite something. And so the debate is, what is the future? Is it this cheap energy American world, or is it the next industrial model? And in what time frame are we talking about this? So we're talking past each other a lot these days on energy. German industry looks across here and says, wow, American energy prices are a quarter of what they are at home. And so back to investment. They're all going to come here. That's what's freaking out the German politicians at the moment. They think German investment's going to come to the United States. But what's already happened? Because energy here is so cheap and we don't need all those imports, they've started to go to Europe now. And what has happened is that has broken already the link the Russians set between oil and gas. They have a price link that keeps those prices at a high level. They already had to force to break that link and renegotiate downward prices for Germany and for Poland and other countries. So just simply what's happening here is already having an impact in Europe, and we haven't even done anything yet because we have laws about exporting ourselves. So we're seeing a new world on energy. It's a world in which we're kind of going this way. And I think there will be some pretty important discussions to be had on that, besides these more politically driven rebalances that I've talked about. So let me stop there because I'm happy to talk whatever you like, but I think maybe that gives us a setting for how we can talk about our relations and sort of the daily headlines. So thank you.
What happened that this trade partnership got underway now? You have said yourself that it has been talked about for a long time. So the stars must have aligned in a certain way that the breakthrough happened. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this. And the second question is somewhat different. I think I read recently in the Frankfurter Allgemeine that Japan, also that there's some interest in including Japan in some of this. Maybe you can talk about it.
Yeah. Well, you're right. I think the stars align. And if we don't do it now, confuse analogies, the window will shut. So it's now or never. Because for 20 years we've been trying this and people are just totally frustrated. So if this isn't real, you're going to lose any interest, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic. I think what's changed is most people point to the economic crisis as the real motivator, that the Europeans are sort of desperate, and this is why. I think there's some element to that. Here's a way to get jobs that doesn't dip into the public till, right? Doesn't create deficits. You're simply expanding markets. And so why not? And why not do it with your most important trading partner, since actually we're almost the only ones that don't have this kind of agreement in the world. And so that's one argument. I think so both sides, feeling a little pressed and say, we really need to do this. And politically, for some leaders, I think that's what put them over the edge. Why would Monsieur Hollande agree to this? He might not be with us at the end. He's with us right now, sort of. And that's a role for Germany as we go along. The famous Franco-German relationship will be tested by Germany's ability to bring Mr. Hollande along. I think that's one element. I think the other is that the skepticism always on the American side about this agreement was the question, can the European Commission, which negotiates, deliver the European Union? Can this commission, these bureaucrats in Brussels, negotiate with us and then 27 governments actually do it? And Americans are pretty skeptical about that because they still don't understand the EU and all the ins and outs of that. And I think on the European side, an equal skepticism. Can the executive branch deliver the U.S. Congress, especially this Congress? And we also have an additional problem for the Europeans that we have independent regulatory agencies that they don't have. And so you have to kind of corral the regulatory people to kind of be part of this. And that's always been a real problem. And what happened was at the summit in November 2011, US-EU summit, they announced the so-called high-level working group to study this and see if it would be in report then. This is good for the students here about political science. So they create a high-level working group as a cover to do something else. So when you ever hear about a commission or a group or something, look for what the motivation really might be rather than the structure. They could have written that study the next day. There were thousands of studies already done on this. I've done a few of them myself. We could have given them the paper the next day. What they did was use about a year or more to sort of answer that skeptical question on both sides. In the US and the EU, they both had a list of sort of really kind of issues to say, show us you can do this. Prove it. And they actually did. Over the last year, this is kind of not in the headlines really, but these are all low-level things. They've actually, both sides have changed a few regulations through procedures so that they could show each other, this time we're serious. And I think President Obama is a pragmatic guy. He's not a woolly-eyed, starry-eyed guy. He finally came down and, believed, yes, we can actually do this. And I think the last reason is that the Doha round simply has collapsed. I think both the US and Europeans would go immediately back to Doha as first choice if we thought it would do anything, which is the multilateral system. It's, it's the basic way we do things. But it has not worked out. So your question, practical question, do you sit there and be purist in principle on multilateralism and nothing's happening and things are getting worse, or do you try another way? And so what you see is they're trying another way. They're trying a plurilateral approach. You get a group of countries, pretty big, to open markets, not only across the Atlantic, but the Pacific. You know, we're doing something across the Pacific too. And you move it that way so that at the end, basically everybody's still, you know, back on open markets, but you just did it a different way. And there's some talk that you'd have to maybe codify these agreements at the end. We have a lot of overlapping agreements. You know, the EU has agreement with Korea. We have agreement with Korea. If you put the two agreements together, there's a lot of overlap. And so maybe, you know, somehow we just align all of that. And Korea, you know, could maybe in some way, part of it could also already be associated with this. So those are, I think, what's really driven a lot of this, and why I think the last piece for the president, he wants this to be a legacy issue. It's a second-term legacy issue. And that's their timeline. You're going to negotiate it and ratify it and get it done by the time he leaves office. It's not the Uruguay round. It's not a never-ending thing. That's very different. I forgot your second question. I'm sorry. Japan. Well, I did say it. Sorry. I think what they have not addressed is whether these agreements will be open. If the U.S. and the EU agree, can others associate with it? That has not been answered very well. The trade types will say, well, not really. I think if you're politically astute, you'll say yes. What about Turkey? Turkey has a customs union with the EU. So the Turks are nervous because they think you get an agreement with the United States, all the U.S. goods will flow through the EU into Turkey. And they weren't at the table. So they're wondering a bit about this. So there might be a reason to have a U.S.-Turkey free trade agreement at the same time you do this one. Now, the Japanese, they're not going to join the US-EU one, although, like I said, why not? But they are joining the Trans-Pacific one now. And if you could use this to open up the Japanese market, something we've tried for decades, that would be significant. That would be a significant achievement. The Americans do not fear a strong Europe. It's the nature of that Europe that's important. If you could build a Europe that's open, it's open to ideas, American ideas, goods and services. We'd love it. That's why we like the single market. A Europe that's open. If that's a principle in which a strong Europe would be built, Americans are your biggest supporters. If you built a Europe that could take care of its own civil wars, so Americans wouldn't have to go across the ocean, as they have, we'd be your biggest supporters. Europe has failed that test time and again. If you could build a Europe that's not under the dominance of any country or group of countries hostile to the United States, we'd like that Europe. That'd be a good Europe. And if you could build a Europe that actually could be a partner for us to deal with this whole other agenda that I mentioned, we would like that, because not even a superpower can deal with those issues by itself. So it's the nature of the Europe that we're talking about, not whether it's weak or strong. You know, which Europe are we talking about? Margaret Thatcher's Europe? Charles de Gaulle's Europe? Angela Merkel's Europe? Helmut Kohl's Europe? Václav Havel's Europe? Václav Klaus's Europe? We don't know, because the Europeans don't know what Europe they're building. They're fighting about it every day. Usually want us to take sides on that kind of Europe. I don't think we'll probably do that. But I think we can say what our interests are and be guided by that. So, and I think that shows also a bit of history here. And this is NATO's, public relations problem, I admit it. But if you think about why NATO was created, it wasn't just created because of a threat from the East. If you go back to that part of history, European history, the real concern of Americans, and I think many Europeans, was that it was Western Europe that was dragging everybody into wars. It was the inability of that part of the continent to get its act together that was the disaster of the 20th century. Yeah, and so certainly as part of World War II and in the aftermath, how do you deal with the Europeans and have them get over that was driving U.S. policy. And so NATO had a different function that was geared as much to its own internal alliance as anything to do with the threat, which is to give the Europeans enough confidence in themselves that they could build this experiment called it's now the European Union. If they, if they hadn't had the Americans there, and and NATO provided this umbrella under which the EU could develop, I don't believe it would have, because I don't believe after such horrific tragedy that Europeans had the confidence to say, let's build our security together instead of looking over our shoulder. And so the key test of the strong Europe one wants to build today is if the Americans weren't there, would you trust each other? Trust each other enough to build this Europe without us? I believe in then the answer is no. And that's a sad statement, but that's where we are with European integration. That's why we still have to, in my view, the United States still plays this role. But we want Europe to develop in certain ways. So NATO plays still a role in terms of providing security reassurance among the Europeans. And that's why, despite pledges of German continuity between administrations, when you actually break with that in your action, like saying to the Poles and to the other East Europeans, we don't need to do contingency planning anymore for a possible threat. There's no threat. That's probably the worst statement you could make to a country like Poland or to the Baltic states that have emerged out of a certain history, and you're trying to convince them you're a reliable ally. And to say, we don't need those nuclear weapons, we don't see a threat, let's just get rid of them, without realizing the symbolic nature of that reassurance those weapons play for other allies. Or let's abstain from Libya. Let's join the Chinese and the Russians in saying we don't really believe that Mr. Gaddafi is about to slaughter his people, and we have no stake in that. That's not continuity. Those are shockers. And I think it's not us as much as other European allies who start to wonder a bit about the Germans. Even the energy gamble, the Energiewende, was done with no consultation with Germany's neighbors. And many of them are dependent on the energy links with Germany. So Germany's emerging. It's got a central role to play, but it's also doing some of the things that some people accuse the United States of sometimes in terms of unilateral activity. And we should keep that in mind. You could see a bit of it in the Euro crisis, obviously, with people on the streets on that. I think that's overdone, but there are concrete reasons why there might be some concern. Is Germany really emerging? Does it really have that sense of solidarity that it's seen by others as reliable, solidarity partner? I think it's part of the debate.
In the debate, the economic crisis was very important. So how do you think we could sort of switch and bring it in a more positive way as you developed it and say, well, this is part of it, but now let's use the crisis to build something new? So far, I think in the media, it's discussed much more as part of the crisis.
It has innovated in many areas, some through many subsidies and government role, to get to a point where it can tie energy innovation into its traditional core manufacturing base. In the Mittelstand companies, this is what they do. They take what we would think would be traditional 19th century industries, and because they innovate in these kind of processes, they turn those traditional things into high-tech 21st century industries that developing countries want, especially China. Germany has a trade surplus with China. This is something. And the Mittelstand companies that are 1, 2, 3 in the world, and their little niche thing that they do, because it's not gee whiz innovation like Americans. When we think of innovation, it's Steve Jobs. In Germany, they're not, when I say not particularly good at that gee whiz innovation, but they're really good, probably almost world class at taking innovation and then putting it into the process of industrial production and making it something new. And that's, I think, the core of this, is you drive innovation through the energy system to create this new industrial model. And you tie it to your export base to go after all of these new rising markets. I mean, that's why Germany is doing so well there, because the Chinese, like I say, they really like this stuff. And that's kind of what they need. So it's not consumerism. It's not the kinds of, just pumping your economy because of reaching into the treasury. It's something really kind of different. And if they could expand that through the EU, because Germany needs the EU base, the single market really has to be the base, then it really has a significant position in the world. But there are problems. As soon as Bavarian farmers start to see these poles, electricity poles, go up across their land, which is what will have to happen if some of this happens with wind power coming down to the south, they're going to start screaming. When they see the consumers see the prices of energy go up even more, which are already high, there are going to be problems like this. So this is a big debate, and we'll see how it goes. But the fact that a conservative chancellor took her her political future and staked it on sort of something really quite different, and that most of German society has gone along with it, including German industry. I mean, this is really, it's something. But it was premised on the notion of a scarce energy future. And that's what our revolution now is challenging. We're saying, what's scarce energy future? It doesn't look like it to us. And so these two models, I think that's why I say it's kind of a disconnect, because we're going to be talking past each other for some time.
Are you talking mainly China, or are there other powers that you really believe are truly emerging in that way? And that there are these other powers that the US and Europe should be approaching together?
Yeah. I believe China is the only potentially systemic challenger. Okay? I think it's just in the league differently than the others. So how you work with China as it, rises and grows, however you want to say, reemerges, whatever you want to say, is really a systemic kind of issue. It really does put it in a different league. And so we can talk about that. But American companies invest more in Brazil than in China. And so do German companies. And so when you're talking about where the markets are and where your future might go over, in other kinds of areas, that's not geostrategy, other countries start to actually become pretty interesting. And if you look at Turkey, this has always been a strategic country, but it continues. My point about the Atlantic, just to just put your head in a different mind, when we talk about globalization, we immediately, it seems to me, at least the media and many politicians, conflate that with China, as if the two are the same thing. Rise of Asia, globalization, that's about what it is, right? Or the BRICS, the BRICS they kind of toss in there. Well, Tom Friedman, simple definition of globalization, it's how continents connect. Well, if that's your definition, then the four continents of the Atlantic, north and south, are connecting in lots of ways that seems to be beyond the ability of the New York Times to sort of figure out. You hear nothing about this. They get captured, herd journalism. Journalists, they get on one topic and then ride it to the end. So the BRICS was sort of the flavor of the day, And so everybody talks about that. But these countries really don't have a lot to do with each other. They're trying to make something of it, but really, what you're seeing is, like I said, I did the energy thing for the Atlantic. It's going to be the energy reservoir for the world, and not only traditional fuels. It's the renewable center of the world. Back to Germany, but also the United States, and Brazil is a renewables superpower. That's where all the innovation is really happening. Biofuels, for instance, 85% of all the biofuels production and trade is in the Atlantic. So if Atlantic countries can figure this out to get to a new generation of biofuels that's better environmentally, we would set that for the world. And Africa would be the place that would benefit most from it. So it's triangular innovation, Europe, US, Latin America, and Africa benefiting. That's a different way of thinking. Why wouldn't we do that? Let's redefine the Atlantic community now in a kind of a different way. If you talk about what's going on in Mali, for instance, what's missed again in newspapers, as far as I see, it's reduced to Al-Qaeda. That's why the French go. But what's really giving this power in an older development is that the narco cartels in South America have crossed the Atlantic. And they are in those spaces, and they're interacting with the terrorists because it's a big, wide open, ungoverned space. So what you're having is South American criminal organizations, very organized, leapfrogging the Atlantic, using West Africa as a transshipment and logistics hub for everything nasty coming into Europe. And guns from here, because of the drug trade, flowing down into South Africa, crossing the Atlantic into Africa, and also going to Europe and other places, and into Africa. So we're having something that's a pan-Atlantic security challenge now. It's not about the French going to, save us from the terrorists in Mali. There's a whole other thing going on here. So I don't want to go on, but I'm just saying, sometimes it's good to just step back and challenge the prevailing frame. I'm very assertive about the Atlantic future. I think there's a big one. I think, and all the interstate conflicts are in Asia Pacific. There aren't any here, so the strategic community goes, well, it's boring. But here's the place where basically democracies could figure out a new way of working together on some human security challenges. And that may be much more interesting. We haven't started there yet. This is way ahead or skewed off or whatever. But I think sometimes the poverty of sort of getting on the herd journalism track blinds us to really other things that are going on.
Yeah, I find the talk very interesting by looking both at political relations between the US and Germany and on the other hand, free trade agreement for coming one. So just two comments to ask if you agree on them. Now, if we look at US-German relations, I think it is fitting to say that while strong ideological disagreements have subsided somewhat, I think it's hard to deny that there is an increasing sense of frustration on the American side about the reluctance of Germans to provide leadership, both in foreign policy as regards Syria, as regards Libya, and also the Euro crisis. So they sort of disappoint the American side by being quite reluctant, also by being quite constrained with regard to a couple of political and institutional constraints by advancing common European policies. And isn't it in this situation a quite clever strategic move from the American side to advance Europeanization, such as through a free trade agreement, by both offering incentives to the Germans and also constraining them to, at least to a degree, politically in a sense. Because on the other hand, if you say that Jack Lew goes to Europe to push the Germans, how is he going to push them? Because in their reluctance, they're actually quite assertive, right? There's sort of assertive reluctance to provide leadership. So isn't Europeanization actually a very smart move to, give something to the Germans to be slightly more advanced in that regard? And secondly, if you look at this sort of slightly more inward-looking perspectives by Germans and also the Europeans, isn't that actually something that both Europeans and Americans right now share to a degree? I mean, the Obama administration is also one that is slightly more inward-looking with nation-building. Actually, I was surprised that Obama used this word 3 or 4 times during the debate because it's usually applied to developing countries, but he was actually courageous in using that word. And there's a greater reluctance to sort of strongly project political interests to the outside. So it's more about economic recovery and so forth. So isn't this free trade agreement simply something that fits very well to American concerns and also quite well to the projection of interest towards the European side? And therefore, a really quite smart move by the Americans to offer that now.
Well, yes, I agree with that. I mean, like I said we're inward-looking too. I think the president captured the public mood. Huge fatigue with all these foreign adventures. Realization we're kind of a mess at home on lots of things, and it's time to focus a little bit. So, whether we'll do that because of our polarized politics, I'm not sure. But no, Americans are very inward, and we're trying to balance, a budget that is premised on worldwide, deployments and all sorts of things, and trying to scale that back. How do you scale that back? Well, sometimes you need help from others who share some of the load, and that's part of the message. But the Europeans are also, having their own problems, and that's the issue. I think, there's, as I said, there's an expectation gap that's gone on for decades between the U.S. and its allies. We always expect more of that. It's just what happens. And every new administration comes in with the same high expectations, and a process of frustration. But it's uneven. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, the Germans will be the main partners on the TTIP. I mean, they're clear. They just will. I mean, that's going to be that's the new glue of the German-American relationship, is to get this right. So that's the case. But then you get to the debate about austerity versus growth, and we're having a different discussion. Then you get to the security dimension, and we're having a really different discussion. So it's selective. But that's the nature, I think, of German power, if I could use that word in a German setting. It's selective. There's a debate in Germany I see sometimes with everybody ganging up on the Germans these days in Europe. They say, we're sort of like America writ small. Everyone gangs up with them big Americans around the world, and because they have to do the things that big power does, and we're having to do that too, because we're like the superpower within Europe. I think that's a conceit, because Germany is not a superpower within Europe. It's a bit too big sometimes for the Europeans, but it's too weak to kind of get it together. And so I think that doesn't help the debate too much by considering you're making that analogy, but I hear that a lot. And I think Germany, again, it's the legacy of the Bond Republic. You define your success through economics, not through other maybe dimensions of power. You can't even talk about power. Power is not a word you even use. So I usually talk to my German friends about weight. If you have big weight in the world, then your absence sometimes is just as important as your action. And I don't know that always registers. If the Germans aren't present, sometimes that's actually just as important as if they are present. And those are the kinds of debates we have.
Yeah, when you think about how the U.S.'s strategy in terms of engaging China versus Europe's strategy in terms of engaging China, it's been different. And I wonder to what extent those differences might factor into the negotiations on the free trade agreement. Because obviously they would have to, walk lockstep together vis-a-vis China.
Yeah. Well, I think I talk to companies that haven't been involved in transatlantic stuff all the time, and they start to hear about this agreement. What's excited them the most about it is, in fact, this angle. It's not opening the transatlantic market because, again, those slow growth. You can use the transatlantic opening to open up global markets. Then they get interested. And so how do you do that? And this is why, again, it's not just another free trade agreement. Part of this is what standards and what rules do we believe in? And do we believe in them essentially together or not? I think that's at the core of this kind of agreement. So back on investment, for instance, we don't have an agreement with the EU. So if we had a US-EU investment treaty, it's probably not hard to do because investment flows pretty well. But we say, these are the principles that we believe in, open investment, this is how it should work, here's the rules that we think are really applicable. And we're going to act on them, not only across the Atlantic, but around the world. That's going to send a big message to countries like China, but others who are emerging markets, who are having their own debates about whether they accommodate themselves to the rules-based international order, or whether they challenge it. They're having those debates. And our message in the middle of those debates is pretty important. What is that message? Well, this is an effort to try to have a message that's somewhat aligned versus one that's pretty muddled. Because over the last few years, it's been a muddled message. Like I said, we have a different message every time. Our group gets in an airplane, flies to Beijing, and says, take our standard. It's the best. Americans, protect this. The Europeans, forget it. This is it. And then the EU delegation, gets in another airplane and flies to Beijing, goes to the other door. The next meeting the Chinese have is the EU says basically the same thing, but hey, we're the world, the trading partner and all this, normative power. This is what you want to do. Well, the answer is then the Chinese standard, because that's our choice. Because if we don't have that, that's what I said about being insufficient. If we don't have a common line on some of these things and say we believe in them, we're going to have the Chinese standard. We're going to have a lowest common denominator type of standard. You see that on food safety. You saw it on toys, lead in toys, all these kinds of things. What happened on lead in toys, though, is interesting, is that for the first time, the US and EU got in the same airplane. And they flew to Beijing and said together, let's have a meeting with the Chinese. We had a triangular meeting on lead in toys a few years ago, after those scandals. And now, guess what? Now we have a pretty good system on lead in toys. You haven't heard about that recently. Because we were working with the Chinese in a triangular way. So part of this is going to set up those types of things, I think, in a lot of standards, in which we say to others, we're not going to lower our standards. You can accede to them, that would be my argument. They need to be able to accede to them, but you're going to accede at this level, not at this level. And we're going to, still protect high standards for health, safety, all those kinds of things for our people. That's the nature of our societies. So if you could send that message, it's not ganging up on China. It's being assertive, finally, about our own values. And I think that's what this potentially could be about, and that's why I say the politics of this, the strategic piece of this, is more than the economics of it. And that we actually believe in this world, this international rules-based international order. And the emerging markets have benefited from it pretty well. So if they really want to benefit, maybe we could work on strengthening it together rather than, have this debate about whether you're going to challenge it or not, and weaken it, because that's the debate we've been in.
There are a lot more questions, but unfortunately our time is up. I would like to thank Professor Hamilton for his wonderful